So many people in the room today have years of experience in media literacy and information literacy and finding innovative ways to bring media into a classroom or another youth media setting. But many of us rarely, if ever, have the opportunity to really hear from the people making the content or developing the policies that so affect our ability to practice media literacy. Educators focus on curriculum needs and activities inside the classroom, and that means they rarely have the time to build the networking that is required to be able to connect to great folks like these. But that will all change this morning. This panel discussion will feature 3 experts in digital and social media. We'll be discussing how content is developed, how audiences are engaged, and how policies are developed. So let's get started by meeting our panelists. And I'm going to share some brief information about each of them, but their full bios are available on the NAMLE conference website. But now I have to find out where those are. Okay. Okay, here we go. Makita Mays Green. Makita is the co-founder and executive director of DigiPlay, an independent consulting firm dedicated to creating quality content for young children. She creates and implements educational content across digital platforms, including online, video game consoles, and mobile devices. She's worked with Grammy Award-winning artist Alicia Keys to create the journals of Mama May and Lily, an immersive child-directed storytelling app. And Makita also serves as the lead user, researcher, and curriculum specialist for Nick Jr. Games. In this capacity, she develops award-winning interactive games and mobile apps across Nick Jr. brands, like Dora the Explorer and Walla Kazam and Bubble Guppies. Prior to her role at Nick Jr., Makita worked as the Director of Education and Research Digital Media at Sesame Workshop, the folks who bring us Sesame Street. She's also the author of a very personal book called Makita, Moving Up in Media, an autobiographical short that details her journey into the children's media industry. Beside her is Erica Branch Ridley. Erica's been working in digital media and broadcast television for over 20 years as Vice President and Executive Producer. I just realized I have this frame here. Okay. Vice President and Executive Producer for the Hispanic Information Telecommunications Network, HITN. Erica oversees the creation of digital games and print classroom materials to advance the learning of early Spanish-speaking English language learners. Try and say that 10 times fast. Through a Ready to Learn grant through the U.S. Department of Education. Erica served at Sesame Workshop as the Vice President of Production for an educational pre-K pilot and led the digital strategy for a show that is probably a fave of many in this room, The Electric Company. See, I told you we'd get a reaction from that. She's worked at TV Land and Nick at Night on shows such as Blue's Clues, Dora the Explorer, and Little Bill. She also created and produced the award-winning live-action children's TV show Story Porch for Black Entertainment Television. Her earlier career experiences included stints at CBS News on the award-winning show 48 Hours and at WNBC working on public affairs shows and network specials. And beside her is Brooke Oberwetter. Brooke is the Manager of External Affairs for Policy in Facebook's Washington, D.C. office, where she manages Facebook's relationships with think tanks, public policy advocacy organizations, and other third-party groups. She also helps manage Facebook's Safety Roadshow program, teaching parents, teachers, and young people about the tools, settings, and resources available on Facebook that help keep people safe. Prior to joining Facebook, Brooke worked as an analyst on the public affairs team at New Media Strategies in Arlington, Virginia, where she focused on regulatory issues. She served as manager of strategic communications at the U.S. Telecom Trade Association and has worked in public policy research roles at the Competitive Enterprise Institute and the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. Brooke attended Denison University in Granville, Ohio, and pursued her master's in public policy at American University in Washington, D.C. So you can see we've got a pretty impressive panel with us today. What I've asked each of them to do is to think about a case study that's one particular project that they've worked on, and to give us a quick overview of that so that you can get a sense of how, we can hear someone's bio but not necessarily understand what it really means day to day. So they could talk a little bit about one project and how they worked on it, and we'll go through that, and then we'll have some discussion and then open it up to the audience. So please think of questions as we are going through.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. Thank you, Sherry, for that beautiful introduction. I'm so honored to be here with you this morning to talk a little bit about what I do in the industry and to talk about what that means, in particular for children. So in gaming, which is where I focus much of my energy, the best product is never created in isolation. In fact, it's really a collaborative effort that involves the interdisciplinary approach of content, research, and production. And what that means is that those key stakeholders come together in a room to discuss the premise of the game, to discuss which characters will appear in the game, to talk about the educational goals of that game. And once that is all settled, that then results in the creation of a game design document, a curriculum design document, and together those two things give birth to a script which evolves and is incorporated into an early prototype or game. And then comes the most fun part of my job, which is testing that game with the experts. It's always important to put the content in front of your core audience because we can sit in the room all day. The reality is we can think about what kids may do, we may wonder, we may make predictions, but it's only when we put that content in front of the audience that we truly know the impact it will have. And we're asking always three critical questions. One, do they understand what the purpose of the game is? Is there a motivating force? What is that driving sense of agency or urgency that encourages them to continue in gameplay? Do they understand how to play the game? Do they understand when to interact with the game? Is that natural? Is it a natural part of the play pattern? Or does the researcher have to sit there and constantly tell the child what to do and when to do it? And the reason I want to bring this up is because we start with a protocol and we think about things that we want to look for in creating media, but it's only when you sit with the audience that you can truly understand what is resonating with them and how that might need to be changed. And so I want to just give you three brief examples today. One is I was testing a game with a child not too long ago, and the child was playing, and the character, as the child was playing, the character was guiding the child and saying, "Great job, you did it, that's it." And as the character was saying these words, "Great job," the child would continue to play. "You did it," the child would continue to play. And then the character said, "That's it." And the child pushed the device away and sat back in the chair. And I said to the child, I looked over and said, "You know, what's wrong? Don't you want to play? Do you want to keep playing?" And the child looked at me and said, "She said, that's it." And so it was an aha moment for me, because for that child, when he heard "that's it," that meant the end. Stop playing. You're finished. And so it was a very important note for me to then take back to the production team and our stakeholders to think about whether we needed to change the language or at least impact the intonation with which that line was delivered by the character. Another example, you see this young boy here who's reaching out to touch the screen, but he's on a computer. And I think that really underscores the notion of children living in a digital age in which touch screens are just an inherent part of their world, right? And what the implication of that is that we know with the penetration of mobile devices, with children having such an intuitive nature to reach out and touch the screens, a lot of companies are really thinking about mobile first as a strategy. The third example, and that's an example that really talks about media and research on a broad level, but the third example I'd like to mention is PanWAPA. At Sesame Workshop, I had an opportunity to work on this global outreach initiative that had the educational goal of global citizenry. And as part of that, as with everything, we take it out and introduce it to the audience. We research it. We want to get their thoughts. And with this particular project, part of the game was an avatar creator that allowed you to create your own avatar. You can use fantastic or realistic color, skin color, hair color, eye color, clothes, shoes, and just be who you want to be in this world. And we took it to Chinatown, and we were testing with a young girl, and she said to me during the interview she liked the game, but there was one thing that she did not like. She had one problem with the game. And I said, can you tell me about it? What don't you like? And she said, "I don't see my hairstyle." And she went on to describe that she wore her hair, she and her friends as well as her cousins, they wore their hair with bangs that covered this front part of their forehead. And it was a big aha moment because she didn't see herself represented. And I think it really underscores the notion that in creating media for children, you really want to make sure that all children are seen, all children are heard, all children are valued, and you really need to test your content with a diverse audience in order to make sure that you're reaching your core audience and making them feel validated in the process. Thank you. So at the end of the day, it's really about constructing engaging and meaningful experiences. And when creating media for children, it's about doing so responsibly. And so I'll just run through these quickly. When you're thinking about personalization, you can do that, but within the constraints of certain guidelines. So children may be able to incorporate their name in the profile, but you don't allow them enough characters to put their first and last name, perhaps just their first name. They can create artwork, but that artwork is saved to the gallery instead of being uploaded directly online. There's modeling, thinking about safe behavior. If a character is in the car, they're in a car seat, or wearing a seatbelt, or in the water, they're wearing a life vest. Thinking about healthy habits as well, encouraging them to eat healthy foods. Agency, children often don't have an opportunity to make a lot of decisions in their lives, so gaming is an opportunity for them to do so, help the character, help solve the problem. And then diversity. This example here on my far right is from the journals of Mama May and Levy, where we have children going on a storytelling adventure in India and exposing them to Indian culture, and that really shows how storytelling and gaming can really be a vehicle to help children travel beyond the constraints of their own backyard and learn about the wider world. This other example is from a STEM game, and we made a very deliberate decision to feature a girl not only in the game, but also to have her host the game, knowing what we know about the percentages of females in the STEM industry. And the last point I want to make is that it's about exposure. If children understand, if they see it, they understand that they can be it, and if they believe that they can be it, they then work harder to achieve it. So, thank you.
Good morning. Like Makita said, I'm very honored to be in this room with all of you and also have an opportunity to talk to you. When I was trying to figure out what to do, Sherry had said to make a case study, and I started thinking, like, I'm a walking case study because I have twin boy and girl. They're 12 now, and I have a 17-year-old. Oh, boy. And making games and making content for them, that in itself is a whole case study of those age groups. But and we'll get into a little bit of that. But for now, I'll just go through a few things. I didn't want to talk about preschool too much because Makita talked about that a little bit, but what I wanted to talk to you about was intergenerational gaming. I've done games for preschool children, for elementary school children, now like 6 to 9, now making content for teachers in the classroom, Head Start teachers with preschool children, and also I've made stuff for TV Land, for the TV Land Nick at Night audience. So different ranges of ages there. But what I wanted to talk to you about, can we go to the first slide? This is what I thought about intergenerational. I thought about just parents with kids and then kids themselves. I said that my twins were 12. Well, they've never known. They go around when they were really little and try to rewind every television set in the house because they don't know a world without a DVR. They don't know that could not rewind television or fast forward. Like, they don't even know, they had no concept of that. They're 12 now, so if you're 12 and they grew up like that, little kids, you know, there's something on, I got this one cartoon where you see the child is saying this iPad doesn't work, and it's actually a book, and he's going to his dad saying this iPad is broken. And that's because, again, there's something on the internet with a baby with a magazine trying to, I don't know if you've ever seen this, trying to move the pages because they think the magazine is an iPad. So that's the audience that I know that a lot of you probably work with and that Makita and we work with every day. So how do you make content for them? How do you get them interested? And then you see the mom here in this picture on the other side saying, asking the baby, how do you get the VHS? Is it even a VCR anymore? Anyway, probably. Get it connected. That is the two different age generations. I worked on a game that was an intergenerational game. It was for parents and kids. And when we went out to make it, it was for Electric Company. One thing that we saw was that the kids were driving. It was a little driving game. They had to drive through the different phonic sounds. And the mom was sitting there. If we can go to the next. Oh, keep going. I'm going to come back to that one.
You can, if you want to.
Oh, I can do that.
Yeah.
There you go.
You don't have to.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. The mom was sitting next to the son, And she kept saying to him, "No, that's not it. No, that's not it. You don't have it." And the son was just sitting there like just shaking his head because he was not having a good time. And I realized a lot of times when you make educational games and your mom or your dad is sitting next to you, I know that I do this, you're trying to prompt them to get the right sound or you know, you want, especially if you're in a situation where there's researchers watching. And I noticed that the mom or the dad wasn't having fun because they were trying to get the child to do certain things, and the child was not having any fun because his mom was over there telling him how to play a racing car game. So when we went back to try to think about how to make games, especially games that are on a computer or maybe on an app, we had to make sure the parent was just engaged. So the game started to become for both of them. And the mom or the dad also had to do something that was, they had to keep themselves busy and have a good time as well. So what we came up with was the game was the mom had to unscramble words that the son was driving through. So if they drove through the word pet, it came out as, I don't know, and the TEP or ETP, and the mom had to race to put it in the right order, and as fast as she would do it, the child would go faster in the car. And what we saw was that when they played together, the mom was just as happy because the son was doing things in an educational way, but the son was happy because he was going faster, or his mom was also having a good time. So in intergenerational gaming, we have to make sure both players were having a good time. I'm bringing this up because I wanted to also, and I'm almost going to talk about audiences. So basically, I talked about all the different types of content, but when we go about it, we think of who we talking to. In a preschool environment, your audience is the child, but because a 3-year-old may not get on the internet and type in a URL, it's really the mom or the grown-up that you want to make sure is having a good time as well, which I just wanted to show this real quick, which is why Sesame Street does so well, because as you all know so well, is a lot of the things in Sesame Street, they always have a funny part for the mom or the dad. So the co-viewing experience is something that the parents could also have like an inside joke, if you will, with the child. This was something that did really well. It's on YouTube. It's a little spoof of, I forgot the name of the commercial, but the Old Spice commercial, yes. And I have it here, but I don't want to take up too much time. Okay. But this was really a wonderful thing. And then the last thing is just with the electric company. When we were making content for electric company, I had to remind PBS that these were 6 to 9-year-olds, and I thought it was really important that kids understand the behind the scenes of how TV shows are made so that they can just aspire to be something in that industry if they wanted to. So we had the kids in the show interview different people behind the scenes, and it really did really well, and kids started to understand what other careers were out there. So I'll just pass on. Thank you.
Thank you. Oops.
Don't tend to do slide-heavy things when I talk about tools that we use on Facebook. And the reason is that those tools are always changing and evolving based on feedback that we get from users. And so the case study that I want to talk about is actually something that was really important to me. It was I've been at Facebook for a little over 4 years now. And right as I was starting at Facebook, Facebook was in sort of the midst, the whole internet industry was actually sort of in the midst of what I call the sort of rise of hysteria over cyberbullying. And I don't want to minimize the problem or the issue, but I think a lot of the response and a lot of the fear-mongering that went on around that was something that the companies were really trying to figure out how to navigate their way through and figure out what are some practical things that we can do to address these issues without sort of playing into the media hysteria that sort of followed it. So Facebook's case study is a little bit different than what we heard here because I'm going to talk about how young people especially respond to user-generated content. This is not content that we sit around and test or that we sit around and talk about. This is content that goes on Facebook that's put there by other Facebook users. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some tools and a process that came about to help young people sort of manage what it was that they were seeing on Facebook and how they would respond to it. So the backdrop, again, was sort of this online bullying situation. We offered lots of programming, lots of educational resources. We did lots of media partnerships. We had lots of training that existed on site as to how to use Facebook in a safe and responsible way. We did a lot of education outreach. But what we didn't have were a lot of tools for what people could do when they actually experienced content on Facebook that made them uncomfortable or that made them feel threatened. And the way we realized that this was a problem was actually very interesting. Our community operations team, which is the team that receives reports. So when you see a piece of content on Facebook, you always have the opportunity to report it for violating Facebook's community standards. This community operations team realized that people who had identified themselves as being between the ages of 13 and 18 were reporting a lot of what they were calling hate speech. And that was just one of the boxes that you could tick off to say why you're reporting a piece of content on Facebook. And we said, well, this is just a picture of a bunch of girls at a pool party, maybe. There's really nothing to this that's hate speech. And they couldn't figure out what it was that was going on until they developed a team that said, why do we feel like there's so much misreporting around hate speech? And what it turned out was that was 13 to 18-year-old girls telling us, I hate this picture. I'm embarrassed by this picture, or I was excluded from this picture and it makes me sad, or I'm embarrassed about the bathing suit that I'm wearing, or my hair looks like, right? I hate this picture equaled hate speech. And that was a very real problem, and we realized that there was a gap in our reporting system that didn't allow people to express the way a piece of content made them feel when they interacted with it on Facebook. So we had kind of a difficult time trying to figure out what those tools would look like. And since the goal of this panel is to sort of peel back the curtain a little bit about what that decision-making process was, I can tell you it wasn't just that community operations team that said, well, let's add another box that people can tick that says, I don't like this photo. We put together a lot at Facebook of what we call cross-functional teams, where we have people from all over the company coming together to talk about how to solve these really complex problems. And so for this, we had, I made a list because it was a whole lot of teams that were involved, our community operations team, our legal team, our privacy team, our public policy team in the US, and then our international public policy teams, and then our data scientists. And those are the guys who are really doing some testing and tweaking of language and visuals on the site to understand how people respond when we change something. And we sat down and we figured out, well, this picture of a bunch of girls at a pool party doesn't on its face violate Facebook's terms of service. It doesn't violate our community standards. But we realized that there might be some contexts in which that photo is used to bully someone, or in which that otherwise innocuous-seeming photo is really being used as a means of harassment. It might depend on what the caption of the photo is, right? A picture of teenage girls in bathing suits labeled as a bunch of beached whales, which is exactly the kind of thing, unfortunately, that we would see on Facebook. So the person who was screening the photo to understand what was wrong with it wouldn't necessarily see that unless they understood the whole context. So what we did was we created a tool that allowed people to report content in a way that signaled to us we need to look at the broader context. And it also gave the person reporting the content an opportunity to do something about that content on their own. It gave them an opportunity to send a message to the person who had posted the content and say, maybe you didn't realize that I'm embarrassed about this photo, or you didn't realize that I feel excluded because I'm not in this photo and it's the rest of our core group of friends, and it's really hurt my feelings. And it turns out that when we gave people the opportunity to do that, they really took advantage of it. And it turned out that a lot of these kinds of things that really had the potential to escalate into off-Facebook bullying or harassment situations were very easily resolved by giving people a technical solution to take matters into their own hands and deal with that content. The great thing about this project, and why I'm so excited about these tools, and we call them our social resolution tools, and that name continues to change as the product continues to change, is that we realized that this was something that we didn't have a whole lot of expertise in, which is how young people approach the idea of compassion, and how young people communicate with each other when it comes to their social emotional responses to things. And to the company's credit, I think this was great. We brought in a bunch of outside people. We brought in a bunch of psychologists. We brought in a bunch of empathy experts, and brought in a bunch of academics and said, you're doing cutting edge research right now in empathy and empathetic communication. how can we incorporate some of this language into these tools? We now have every year at Facebook, what's called Compassion Research Day, which is where we bring in these academics and experts from around the world to come and have this day-long conference to talk about what's going on in social emotional understanding and communication research, to talk about ways that we can improve our tools so that when people see those checkboxes and are reporting a piece of content, we've got the language just right. And this is where some of that user testing that the other panelists talked about really comes in handy, is because it turns out that very, very small tweaks to that language vastly, vastly change the likelihood that someone is going to follow through with a report or follow through with an action on Facebook. So just the difference between "it's embarrassing" or "I'm embarrassed by it" had a massive change in the likelihood that someone would finish that report or finish that communication. One of the things when people are when I'm using the social reporting tools and I want to communicate with, say, Michelle, that a piece of content that she's posted has made me uncomfortable, we auto-populate a dialogue box that suggests some language that I could use when I'm reaching out to Michelle. And it turns out that the words that are in that dialogue box matter a lot. If the person who sees it, and you have the opportunity to change it, right? You can delete it and write your own message. But if you are turned off or put off by the language that auto-populates there, you'll just hit cancel and you won't finish the report. So we spend a lot of time now doing testing, working with social psychologists, working with youth therapists to try to figure out exactly what language is more likely to lead to a resolution in with these tools. And I think we found the evidence we have is largely anecdotal with respect to sort of the real world outcomes, but I've done a whole lot of speaking in high schools where students have come up to me afterwards and said, the ability to do that, the ability to reach out to someone and ask them to take down a photo without me having to tell on them, without me having to report it to Facebook directly, that really prevented a bigger problem from happening. That really stopped this issue from escalating into the classroom or onto the school bus or into the cafeteria. And it's because I had that tool and that resource that I was able to handle this situation myself in what was a reasonable and rather mature way. So that's just one case study where we brought in people from all over the company to really think about what the best approach was and really think about what the best solution was. It's something that I'm really proud to have worked on and something I'm really proud to be able to share with high school students, especially when I speak to them.
Great. Thank you for that. So one of the things I think of in terms of the intersection between the creating content part and the policy part is COPPA. And a couple of you have mentioned that. And so first I'm wondering how many folks in the room have ever heard of the COPPA rule. Folks know about that at all? So could you touch on especially the content creators first and then from Facebook's perspective too? How does that, what's your understanding of what COPPA is? It's the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. So how does that impact the work that you do? Because there's a connection between content and policy there.
Certainly for the work that I do, it really underscores the importance of striking that balance, right? We know that children like to express themselves. Creative gaming is some of the most popular gaming out there, but at the same time, children don't necessarily understand the necessity behind being private and the larger implications of putting information out there for all to see. And so for us, we always try to strike a balance. We want to make sure that children, as I said in the example before, that they have an opportunity to be creative, to create artwork. For example, they might want to create something for their mom or their teacher in an art tool that we've created, but we want to always make sure that in the creation of that, we're allowing them to do it in a safe environment. So when you save something, saving it to a gallery, not allowing you to post it directly online, limiting the amount of characters that you have if you're inputting your profile. They love to type in their name, especially young preschoolers. They get so excited about that. But we always want to make sure that we're not encouraging them to type in your first name and the last name. And the hope is that in applying these skills early on as they move forward in life, perhaps there's a nugget of that will stay with them in thinking, I don't necessarily need to put everything out there. I can limit the amount of information but still have a fulfilling experience at the same time.
In my work, especially working now, making apps for kids in a classroom, we're making them for tablets. So sometimes the teacher will put the kids together in groups of 5 and they'll play the game. So a couple of things. When at Sesame, we wanted to allow the teacher to have her own tablet, and if she wanted to take pictures of the child or to record what was going on, especially when it comes to early language learning, because some of it we want the kids to be able to use some of the new vocabulary that they're learning. But even then, we have to make sure that, like Makita said, that those files can't be sent out on the internet, or the teacher can make sure that they just save in the gallery or just on that device, so she could, show the parents or show her her advisor or her principal if there was something going on there. So it's as we create it, we have to really be. It's important to keep an eye on, because sometimes when we get vendors to create the content, they're not thinking in that way as well, to make sure that things are protected and inside when it comes to kids. So we have to always keep that in mind.
So a little bit on the policy side, because I know that not everybody raised their hand when we asked about familiarity with COPPA. Essentially what it does is it requires that any online service offering that requires the collection of data about any person under 13 requires parental consent. And the mechanism for that parental consent can vary, but there are some specified guidelines within COPPA about sort of boxes that a service provider has to check before they're able to collect any information about anyone under 13. Facebook and the internet industry have difficulty with this because it's very easy for kids to lie. The sort of industry standard solution for the larger internet service providers has been to comply with COPPA by making it very clear that our services are made for people who are over the age of 13. So in terms of COPPA compliance, we don't have to have a parental consent mechanism in place because our service is only operated to people over 13. And of course, when I come into a room full of teachers and say there's no one on Facebook under 13, it's always a great laugh line. Because we know that they're there and we know that they're lying. We do have some systems in place that were developed in partnership with our privacy team and our policy team to try to mitigate that, to try to see what we can do to keep people who are under 13 off of Facebook. If, for example, when you first are signing up for Facebook and you happen to put your real birth date and you're 11 years old, we won't just deny your ability to create an account at that time. We'll also IP block that computer from creating any subsequent accounts, because the likely thing that people do is they say, well, it didn't work when I'm 11, I'm going to make myself 26. And so we make it so that you can't immediately go back and try to create another account. There are a couple of technical solutions like that we use on the back end. But from Facebook's perspective on the policy side, on the public policy side, is we want to make sure that COPPA is implemented in a way that benefits the really diverse internet ecosystem and app ecosystem that Facebook is a part of. So if you're offering an educational app, if you're offering an app that helps a student, for example, with their multiplications times tables, and it's supposed to learn over time, they're really good at 5s, but they're really bad at 8s. Let's show this student more 8s so that they get better at their multiplication of 8s. We want the app to be able to do that. We want the app to be able to remember that this is a kid who's good at 5s and not good at 8s. We want to make sure that COPPA doesn't restrict an app's ability to do that, and that it doesn't require a very cumbersome parental authentication mechanism in order to offer that service. So there are some things about COPPA that I think on the policy side need to be revisited, as we've seen really broad changes in how the app ecosystem has worked. But for the most part, obviously the spirit of COPPA and protecting the privacy of children is something that I think everybody is committed to.
I'm actually going to jump to a couple different topics so that, because in about 3 minutes I'll see if there are questions out here and try to touch on different things. So Eric, I'm going to ask this question to you, although anybody can respond. So you're earlier in your career were working in television and migrated to digital, and I know Makita did that as well. What's the difference for you? What are the different skill sets? What is it from a production standpoint? Differences or similarities? Because we're consumers on that side of it, but how does it affect a creator?
There's a lot of it that is the same, so I'll just say that right now. One thing that I've learned is production is production. So even when I or any of you, we put a birthday party together or a party together. You know, there are certain things you have to do to make sure everything is the music is right. You have to make sure all those things are intact. In television, I worked in news at first, and, you know, with news, it was, you know, camera people and it was editors. But when I moved over to the internet, and everybody at that time thought I was crazy because, you know, this internet thing, it's not going to stay around that long, and nobody's ever going to watch TV on the internet because, you know, that's crazy. So when I moved over, instead of camera people, instead of editors, it became graphic artists, it became programmers. And on my side, I don't program. I understand the programming language, but I don't program. And I'm not a graphic artist, but it's about pulling together really smart people who are very creative to make the vision that you're looking for. So that's what you do in TV, that's what we're doing on the internet, that's what I'm doing in app development now even. So it's production. The way it's different in a good way for me, I think, is that television is a linear, like, lean back watching situation. And what's so exciting to me about interactive media is that it can take you one step further. You now can play with, especially when it comes to children, you can now be in that world. For Electric Company, we made something called Prankster Planet, and it was, a long time ago, it was called Convergence, and I know with Dora, it was, you know, get Dora to your TV set, and you had to help Dora online, do this, do that, and then she was going to come to your TV. In Prankster Planet, it was you had to watch a little cartoon on television, and then there was something happened, and you had to go online to save the heroes. So the child then became the hero to save their heroes. So now they can participate in a way that you can't do when you're just sitting back. So that's what's so exciting about, if you will, putting together something that's interactive than in linear, because you can think further. You can go through. I used to play with my play set and my dolls, but now I can actually do things. In fact, there's an app that a company called Toca Boca makes that's called Tea Party. So kids can actually have a tea party, and they can pour I mean, it sounds crazy, but they can pour everything, and they can serve, and they can use their app as a place to kind of have a tea party with their friends. So even though I know there's nothing that's taking back from non-digital world and the touching and the feeling, and that is always going to be very, very key when it comes to children, but now it's kind of taking their fantasy a little bit further, and that's what is exciting to me.
And a plug for Toca Boca.
And a plug for Toca Boca.
Hair salon. Play the hair salon app. So do we have, any questions from the audience yet? You can see if folks have. Oh, I thought you were going to say you had a question.
Oh, no.
Yeah, please do.
I think just to echo what Erica was saying, I think the other thing that's really exciting for me about creating digital media content for young children in particular is that they have an opportunity to really be doers. And when you think about educational content, it's an opportunity for the content to grow with the child, for the games to grow with the child. So it becomes a very personal experience. If I'm playing a math game, for instance, and I'm doing very well, the game can then level up and give me more challenging content. Or if I'm playing a game and I'm at a certain level and I'm not doing very well, the game can then level down. So I think there's a lot of advantages from an educational standpoint, both in the classroom as well as with parents at home.
Hi, this is a question actually, Makeda?
Yes.
But everybody can answer it. But you had been talking about, I guess, what is sort of a fine line between creating a world, a diverse world for people versus a world in which people can see themselves. And how do you confront the seeming incongruity there?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think we want to be as inclusive as possible, but at the end of the day, you are limited by a certain amount of assets and budget. But I think there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One is worldview, and one of the ways in which we can meet that demand and help to answer that question is by making sure that there are a diverse group of people at the table at the outset of the experience, that the creators in the room are bringing a different worldview to the table so that we can think about the foods that we'll put in the game, the names of the characters, the environments that we'll showcase. The other piece of that is making sure that when we go out into schools and classrooms, or when kids come to us in the research facility, that we're reaching far and wide to make sure that we're touching children across various age groups within that target audience. And I think, it just speaks to the need of and the advantage today of being able to create media on a mass level. There's nothing more exciting right now than all of the technology that's out there that allows people to not just be consumers of media, but producers of media. And so to the extent that we can encourage children to create content, parents, students to create content and put those messages out there and see themselves represented in the most positive light possible, I think that's one thing that we can do to address that.
I thought I saw a gentleman there. The gentleman, I'm sorry, the gentleman right here? Yes.
Hi. A lot of what you've talked about is, I guess I would phrase as pull as opposed to push. And I wonder, because you need your products to be used, how you balance push and pull with using technology, and do they have to be separate things, or are there ways that you can sort of embed push in pull or pull in push? I'm not sure. Does that make sense as a question?
Could you clarify a little what?
Push as in sort of get it out to kids and they'll do what they want to do with it, or pull as in trying to get them to come to you.
Well, and let me just clarify. So, right, push is generally regarded as I didn't really ask for it; it came to me. It showed up in my inbox. It showed up in It showed up on my news feed. It showed up, right? As opposed to pull, where you're push. Yeah, push is coming out from you. Pull coming back the other way.
And then within some of the products, it sounds like you want kids to learn something. So in a way, you're kind of maybe they sought it out, but you're pushing content at them and how you manage whatever your goals are in that way, as opposed to just, fluff, which could be entertaining.
I'll start. I think it's actually a little bit different for Facebook because as a platform company, we have the ability to make lots of tweaks all the time. And so I think maybe some of the pull that you're hearing about is like we do a lot of this testing and we go out and we try to get as much information as we can at the outset to try to make the product as good as we can before we push it. Right? So I think that's how we sort of manage push and pull, is that pull comes first. We want to get as much information from potential users and from potential adopters of the technology as we can before we push it out. Now that's very different with between a static game that, right, it goes in the App Store and it gets pushed out and people download it and use it, versus Facebook, where we and this is bad phrasing because this is the term we use internally, we do pushes, we do code pushes pretty much weekly. So we change something about how Facebook works just constantly, right? We move a button 2 pixels to the left because we think people will be able to see it better. We do. So there's a lot of pull that we're doing in a continuous way about our product so that we can push changes. I think that's a little different with a game or even with a television program where you do as much research as you can at the outset, right? You're pulling as much information in as you can before you launch the product because you don't really have the ability to do that sort of ongoing change.
Thank you for saying that, because that kind of reminded me of something. I think for kids, because we talked about since they're not going to really go to their email to see what's going on, or they're not going to, they're going to go to television, and see the show, especially when you work on a website or an app for a show. But one thing I will tell you, just to date myself a little bit, but when Nick Jr. first started, it was a website with few games for kids. And what was happening is, at that point, television, I kept having to think of myself as a pioneer, because the television folks did not want to put a URL at the bottom of the screen that said nickjr.com, or they didn't want, oh my God, do not say go to nickjr.com, because kids will turn off the television and they'll never come back because they can't do two things at one time. Don't do that. And so how were kids going to come to see the new content that you had? So what was happening is there was a slow migration, and that's what we're seeing now, to the sites becoming more for parents. So like Nick Jr. used to be just kids, and then it went to be more for parents. Because what would happen is we would slowly put articles about potty training and, just things talking to the mom, but then say, here's a game, here, and then the mom would be the one to take the child and go watch the game. Because at a preschool audience, they're not going to be the one that's going to, they just want Dora, or they just want Blue's Clues. And so the mom would have to be the one. So at night when the kids were sleeping, we'd kind of talk to her to get the kids to come. Older kids will watch TV and go to the website. And then, of course, adults at TV Land, they would want to go, and you could send them information. You could send them emails. You could send them text messages. But for kids, I know for preschoolers, there was this migration of sites going toward really being more about parents to try to get them to learn, so that would pull the parents into. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. We could push out to the parents because we couldn't push out to the child. Does that answer?
Yeah, I think there's another question there.
So, question for Brooke. I have a bullying prevention museum, so we thank you for these new social resolution tools. So I'm curious, how many kids are using the tools, and how can we help you as parents and educators get the word out on this?
Absolutely. So the tools they've actually gone through several iterations since I started at Facebook, and they were launched in 2011. We don't keep comprehensive data on exactly how many resolutions happen, or how, what exactly the statistics are with respect to each individual type of reporting. So what I can tell you from my experience is that it's anecdotal. We just don't make those other numbers public with respect to what our reports are. I mean, we have them. Our data scientists tell me that it works really, really well. That anecdotally has been my experience on the road to hearing from people. In terms of education, though, I think that's the biggest thing. And we spent, I spent 2 years on the road after the tools rolled out, really hitting it very hard in every safety event that I did, talking about these tools and how people could use them to resolve or prevent conflicts. And they work just like reporting anything else on Facebook, right? If you see a picture or a piece of content, there is on every piece of content on Facebook an opportunity to report it. And most of it is, we have our typical sort of things that violate our community standards, which includes hate speech, it includes violence, pornography, nudity. I think there are a couple of other buckets. And then there's one now that just says, I don't like this. And when you click on I don't like this, it takes you to this reporting flow. So it really is the same process for reporting other kinds of content. It's just if it doesn't fit into one of those buckets of things that is very clear, right? This is very obviously nudity. This is very obviously graphic violence, and those things don't belong on Facebook. This is this sort of vague catch-all, I don't like this photo, I don't like this link, I don't like this. And that's how people are able to access those tools. I will point out that if you try to do this on your own on Facebook, unless you have identified yourself as between the ages of 13 and 18, it will look different for you. They have a few more options. They have, the language is different. We have done a whole lot of A/B testing and research to indicate that the language that demographic group uses is slightly different than somebody who would be, say, our age, who reports a piece of content. So that language is different. The reporting structure is a little bit different. Also, internationally, it's different, right? People use different phrases to sort of express what they're feeling about a piece of content, and so it's on a country by country and age demographic by demographic basis. But
Brooke, just a quick question about that.
Sure.
So, if to the question that was asked, if the teachers want to engage students in a conversation about the policies about Facebook and privacy, where on Facebook's website do we find that?
So that's a great question. I would start with our community standards. And I believe it's just facebook.com/community standards. And that is sort of the rules of the road for Facebook. What kinds of things are appropriate to share on Facebook, which is a global community of nearly 1.5 billion people who have different expectations of what it means to be safe, and be in a safe environment. And so what we've tried to do is structure these community guidelines in a way that make all of those 1.5 billion people feel safe. And I think that's a great jumping off place to start a conversation, is what are those community standards. It's also, from a media literacy perspective, a really interesting conversation to think about, how do you possibly create a speech policy for 1.5 billion people? How do you make sure that all of those 1.5 billion people don't come in contact with content or positions or statements that make them feel threatened or make them feel unsafe? How do you navigate the rules of the road? I am thankful every day not to be on the team that has to wrestle with those issues, because it is hard. Yeah.
So in a lot of the digital gaming world, especially for the younger kids, I've seen some brilliant stuff when it comes to teaching or having kids practice discrete cognitive skills. I'm wondering if folks who are in production now are also doing what much of the television did, but I'm not seeing in the games, which was also to model thinking skills, especially inquiry skills about the games they're using themselves and what's in the games themselves. So I'm wondering if those conversations are happening, and then what some of the solutions are. And this is really to all three of you, so to Facebook too, it would be, even though you're not a game, although some people, I think, use you that way, if you find this thing like the difference between hate speech and I just don't like this, is there an attempt to help educate kids and engage them in a dialogue about this is what hate speech is and why it's an important concept?
I think as a platform company, there's a limit to what we can do. People encounter all kinds of political beliefs and political speech, whether it's hate speech, whether it's political opinions they disagree with. There are plenty of those conversations going on Facebook this week, as many of you know. It can't be a platform company's responsibility to educate people about each and every one of those issues. So we do rely on partnerships with, we have a safety advisory board of organizations that help us do outreach and education on those programs. We enter into a lot of partnerships. We engage with as many groups as we can who are out in the field working on those issues, because it's not our issue. It's not our area of expertise to be informing people about what precisely hate speech is. And our policy also governs not just the U.S., but also every other country. And what we define as hate speech here in the U.S. might not be defined as hate speech somewhere else. So we have to work out a policy that covers all of it. And so it's not necessarily for us to do that education, but we definitely support civil society organizations that do work on that education, because it's incredibly important.
Yeah.
I think on the television side, certainly from a linear perspective, there are quite a bit of think out loud moments where you hear the character ask a question and pause, and the child or children then have an opportunity to call out the answer. In the digital gaming side, we try to mirror that by having certain answer sets on screen. So the question is asked, the answer sets are on screen, and the child isn't encouraged to think about it. Okay, can you?
Separate from the cognitive skills, there are inquiry skills.
Yes.
Why is this character this shape? Or what else is this game? What other messages or the backgrounds of this game?
Sure. Yeah, no. Yes, so no, certainly getting to that, because I think you raise a very important point, and what I was going to say is on the cognitive level, I think it's a little bit easier to address when you're thinking about core mathematical and literacy skills. However, one of the things that we're finding ourselves having a lot of conversations about now is how do we make gaming a really fun, engaging experience around the social and emotional aspect? How do we get kids to think about the questions that you're asking? It's a challenge for us because the input, for gaming, there's a certain input that you want, right? And I think for questions such as how are you thinking about body type, how are you thinking about different issues, how are you thinking about your place in the world, really necessitates a larger conversation. I would say it's something that the industry has not yet cracked, but certainly something that we're having conversations about. And I would love to talk to you further if you have any thoughts about ways that we can do that more effectively for the audience.
Erica, you want to make a brief statement?
Yeah.
It's up to you. Yeah.
Really quickly, we on this we're doing something with Pocoyo, and on our app there was a interactive book, and we were seeing that kids were just kind of listening to the story. So we made a story maker where they make something, they make like a picture, and then Pocoyo comes on and asks you to tell him about his picture. So that's not, we're trying to add a little bit more in, but then the hope is that the kids will say, I made a picture about, once, and tell Pocoyo what it is. We had to add him going like this because the kids were just not talking, but we're hoping that that's going to get them talking, because making apps for ELL students, we want them to start using some of the language that they're learning in the games that they're playing, and then we have something that they now tell a story. But we had to get to that because of what you're saying. It was kind of like we weren't knowing if they were going to talk through it. So.
Just add one thing that we did in the journals of Mama May and Lily. There's actually a journal section that probes questions such as, what are you most proud of? Things that you might be afraid of. And it gives children an opportunity to actually write out their responses. And for kids who are early or non-readers, there's also an art tool that allows them to visually express how they're feeling about that. So that's also something you might be interested in checking out.
I know that there are probably a lot of other questions for folks. In the interest of time, we're going to have to stop this part of the conversation. Hopefully, folks can follow up with you at another time. But I'm so appreciative that all three of you came down or over or up from wherever from all the different places you were coming from to participate in the NAMLE conference. So thank you so much.